Welcome to Verbum Day, a channel for scripture, prayer, and sacred classics. Today we begin Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, a Carmelite friar and major mystic of the 16th century, a key voice in the Carmelite reform, and a doctor of the Church for his teaching on prayer and the interior life. His writings guide the soul through purification and toward union with God in love. In Part 1, we begin with the introduction and prologue, to receive the work's framework, then enter Book, the first chapters, 1 to 14, where the author unfolds the night of sense. How God purifies the subtle attachments of beginners, leading the soul through dryness and darkness toward maturity in love. Now, we begin Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, Doctor of the Church. Part 1. Introduction. Somewhat reluctantly, out of respect for a venerable tradition, we publish the Dark Night as a separate treatise, though in reality it is a continuation of the ascent of Mount Carmel and fulfills the undertakings given in it. The first night, or purgation, is of the sensual part of the soul, which is treated in the present stanza and will be treated in the first part of this book, and the second is of the spiritual part. Of this speaks the second stanza, which follows, and of this we shall treat likewise in the second and the third part, with respect to the activity of the soul, and in the fourth part, with respect to its passivity. This fourth part is the Dark Night. Of it the saint writes in a passage which follows that just quoted. And the second night, or purification, pertains to those who are already proficient, occurring at the time when God desires to bring them to the state of union with God. And this latter night is a more obscure and dark and terrible purgation, as we shall say afterwards. In his 3 earlier books he has written of the active night, of sense and of spirit. He now proposes to deal with the passive night in the same order. He has already taught us how we are to deny and purify ourselves with the ordinary help of grace, in order to prepare our senses and faculties for union with God through love. He now proceeds to explain, with an arresting freshness, how these same senses and faculties are purged and purified by God with a view to the same end, that of union. The combined description of the 2 nights completes the presentation of active and passive purgation, to which the saint limits himself in these treatises, although the subject of the stanzas which he is glossing is a much wider one, comprising the whole of the mystical life, and ending only with the divine embraces of the soul, transformed in God through love. The stanzas expounded by the saint are taken from the same poem in the 2 treatises. The commentary upon the second, however, is very different from that upon the first, for it assumes a much more advanced state of development. The active night has left the senses and faculties well prepared, though not completely prepared, for the reception of divine influences and illuminations in greater abundance than before. The saint here postulates a principle of dogmatic theology, that by himself, and with the ordinary aid of grace, man cannot attain to that degree of purgation which is essential to his transformation in God. He needs divine aid more abundantly. However greatly the soul itself labors, writes the saint, it cannot actively purify itself so as to be in the least degree prepared for the divine union of perfection of love, if God takes not its hand and purges it not in that dark fire. The passive nights, in which it is God who accomplishes the purgation, are based upon this incapacity. Souls begin to enter this dark night when God draws them forth from the state of beginners, which is the state of those that meditate on the spiritual road, and begins to set them in the state of progressives, which is that of those who are already contemplatives, to the end that, after passing through it, they may arrive at the state of the perfect, which is that of the divine union of the soul with God. Before explaining the nature and effects of this passive night, the saint touches, in passing, upon certain imperfections found in those who are about to enter it, and which it removes by the process of purgation. Such travelers are still untried proficients, who have not yet acquired mature habits of spirituality, and who therefore still conduct themselves as children. The imperfections are examined one by one, following the order of the 7 deadly sins, in chapters 2 to 8, which once more reveal the author's skill as a director of souls. They are easy chapters to understand, and of great practical utility, comparable to those in the first book of the Ascent, which deal with the active purgation of the desires of sense. In chapter 8, St. John of the Cross begins to describe the passive night of the senses, the principal aim of which is the purgation, or stripping of the soul of its imperfections and the preparation of it for fruitive union. The passive night of sense, we are told, is common and comes to many, whereas that of spirit is the portion of very few. The one is bitter and terrible, but the second bears no comparison with it, for it is horrible and awful to the spirit. A good deal of literature on the former night existed in the time of St. John of the Cross, and he therefore promises to be brief in his treatment of it. Of the latter, on the other hand, he will treat more fully, since very little has been said of this, either in speech or in writing, and very little is known of it, even by experience. Having described this passive night of sense, in chapter 8, he explains with great insight and discernment how it may be recognized whether any given aridity is a result of this night, or whether it comes from sins or imperfections, or from frailty or lukewarmness of spirit, or even from indisposition or humors of the body. The saint is particularly effective here, and we may once more compare this chapter with a similar one in the Ascent, that in which he fixes the point where the soul may abandon discursive meditation and enter the contemplation which belongs to loving and simple faith. Both these chapters have contributed to the reputation of St. John of the Cross as a consummate spiritual master, and this not only for the objective value of his observations, but because, even in spite of himself, he betrays the sublimity of his own mystical experiences. Once more, too, we may admire the crystalline transparency of his teaching and the precision of the phrases in which he clothes it. To judge by his language alone, one might suppose at times that he is speaking of mathematical, rather than of spiritual operations. In chapter 10, the saint describes the discipline which the soul in this dark night must impose upon itself. This, as might be logically deduced from the Ascent, consists in allowing the soul to remain in peace and quietness, content with a peaceful and loving attentiveness toward God. Before long, it will experience enkindlings of love, chapter 11, which will serve to purify its sins and imperfections and draw it gradually nearer to God. We have here, as it were, so many stages of the ascent of the mount, on whose summit the soul attains to transforming union. Chapters 12 and 13 detail with great exactness the benefits that the soul receives from this aridity, while chapter 14 briefly expounds the last line of the first stanza and brings to an end what the saint desires to say with respect to the first passive night. At only slightly greater length, St. John of the Cross describes the passive night of the spirit, which is at once more afflictive and more painful than those which have preceded it. This, nevertheless, is the dark night par excellence, of which the saint speaks in these words. The night which we have called that of sense may and should be called a kind of correction and restraint of the desire rather than purgation. The reason is that all the imperfections and disorders of the sensual part have their strength and root in the spirit, where all habits, both good and bad, are brought into subjection. And thus, until these are purged, the rebellions and depravities of sense cannot be purged thoroughly. Spiritual persons, we are told, do not enter the second night immediately after leaving the first. On the contrary, they generally pass a long time, even years, before doing so, for they still have many imperfections, both habitual and actual. Chapter 2. After a brief introduction, chapter 3, the saint describes with some fullness the nature of this spiritual purgation, or dark contemplation, referred to in the first stanza of his poem, and the varieties of pain and affliction caused by it, whether in the soul or in its faculties, chapters 4 to 8. These chapters are brilliant beyond all description. In them we seem to reach the culminating point of their author's mystical experience. Any excerpt from them would do them an injustice. It must suffice to say that St. John of the Cross seldom again touches those same heights of sublimity. Chapter 9 describes how, although these purgations seem to blind the spirit, they do so only to enlighten it again with a brighter and intenser light, which it is preparing itself to receive with greater abundance. The following chapter makes the comparison between spiritual purgation and the log of wood, which gradually becomes transformed through being immersed in fire, and at last takes on the fire's own properties. The force with which the familiar similitude is driven home impresses indelibly upon the mind the fundamental concept of this most sublime of all purgations. Marvelous, indeed, are its effects. From the first enkindlings and burnings of divine love, which are greater beyond comparison than those produced by the night of sense, the one being as different from the other as is the body from the soul. For this latter is an enkindling of spiritual love in the soul, which, in the midst of these dark confines, feels itself to be keenly and sharply wounded in strong divine love, and to have a certain realization and foretaste of God. No less wonderful are the effects of the powerful divine illumination which from time to time enfolds the soul in the splendors of glory. When the effects of the light that wounds and yet illumines are combined with those of the enkindlement that melts the soul with its heat, the delights experienced are so great as to be ineffable. The second line of the first stanza of the poem is expounded in 3 admirable chapters, 11 to 13, while one short chapter 14 suffices for the 3 lines remaining. We then embark upon the second stanza, which describes the soul's security in the dark night, due, among other reasons, to its being freed not only from itself, but likewise from its other enemies, which are the world and the devil. This contemplation is not only dark, but also secret. Chapter 17, and in chapter 18 is compared to the staircase of the poem. This comparison suggests to the saint an exposition chapters 18 and 19 of the 10 steps or degrees of love, which comprise St. Bernard's mystical ladder. Chapter 21 describes the soul's disguise, from which the book passes on chapters 22 and 23 to extol the happy chance which led it to journey in darkness and concealment from its enemies, both without and within. Chapter 24 glosses the last line of the second stanza. My house being now at rest, both the higher and the lower portions of the soul are now tranquilized and prepared for the desired union with the spouse, a union which is the subject that the saint proposed to treat in his commentary on the 5 remaining stanzas. As far as we know, this commentary was never written. We have only the briefest outline of what was to have been covered in the third, in which, following the same effective metaphor of night, the saint describes the excellent properties of the spiritual night of infused contemplation, through which the soul journeys with no other guide or support, either outward or inward, than the divine love which burned in my heart. It is difficult to express adequately the sense of loss that one feels at the premature truncation of this eloquent treatise. We have already given our opinion upon the commentaries thought to have been written on the final stanzas of The Dark Night. Did we possess them, they would explain the birth of the light, dawn's first breathings in the heavens above, which breaks through the black darkness of the active and the passive nights. They would tell us, too, of the soul's further progress towards the sun's full brightness. It is true, of course, that some part of this great gap is filled by St. John of the Cross himself in his other treatises, but it is small compensation for the incomplete state in which he left this edifice of such gigantic proportions that he should have given us other and smaller buildings of a somewhat similar kind. Admirable as are the spiritual canticle and the living flame of love, they are not so completely knit into one whole as is this great double treatise. They lose both in flexibility and in substance through the closeness with which they follow the stanzas, of which they are the exposition. In The Ascent and the Dark Night, on the other hand, we catch only the echoes of the poem, which are all but lost in the resonance of the philosopher's voice and the eloquent tones of the preacher. Nor have the other treatises the learning and the authority of these. Nowhere else does the genius of St. John of the Cross for infusing philosophy into his mystical dissertations find such an outlet as here. Nowhere else, again, is he quite so appealingly human. For, though he is human even in his loftiest and sublimest passages, this intermingling of philosophy with mystical theology makes him seem particularly so. These treatises are a wonderful illustration of the theological truth that grace, far from destroying nature, ennobles and dignifies it, and of the agreement always found between the natural and the supernatural, between the principles of sound reason and the sublimest manifestations of divine grace. Dark Night. Exposition of the stanzas describing the method followed by the soul in its journey upon the spiritual road to the attainment of the perfect union of love with God, to the extent that is possible in this life. Likewise are described the properties belonging to the soul that has attained to the said perfection, according as they are contained in the same stanzas. Prologue. In this book are first set down all the stanzas which are to be expounded. Afterwards, each of the stanzas is expounded separately, being set down before its exposition. And then each line is expounded separately, and in turn, the line itself also being set down before the exposition. In the first two stanzas are expounded the effects of the two spiritual purgations, of the sensual part of man and of the spiritual part. In the other six are expounded various and wondrous effects of the spiritual illumination and union of love with God. Stanzas of the soul. On a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings. Oh, happy chance. I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest. In darkness and secure, by the secret ladder disguised. Oh, happy chance. In darkness and in concealment, my house being now at rest. In the happy night, in secret, when none saw me, nor I beheld aught, without light or guide, save that which burned in my heart. This light guided me more surely than the light of noonday, to the place where he well, I knew who, was awaiting me, a place where none appeared. Oh, night that guided me. Oh, night more lovely than the dawn. Oh, night that joined beloved with lover, transformed in the beloved. Upon my flowery breast, kept holy for himself alone. There he stayed sleeping, and I caressed him, and the fanning of the cedars made a breeze. The breeze blew from the turret as I parted his locks. With his gentle hand he wounded my neck and caused all my senses to be suspended. I remained, lost in oblivion. My face I reclined on the beloved. All ceased and I abandoned myself, leaving my cares forgotten among the lilies. Begins the exposition of the stanzas, which treat of the way and manner which the soul follows upon the road of the union of love with God. Before we enter upon the exposition of these stanzas, it is well to understand here that the soul that utters them is now in the state of perfection, which is the union of love with God, having already passed through severe trials and straits by means of spiritual exercise in the narrow way of eternal life, whereof our Saviour speaks in the Gospel, along which way the soul ordinarily passes in order to reach this high and happy union with God. Since this road, as the Lord himself says likewise, is so straight, and since there are so few that enter by it, the soul considers it a great happiness and good chance to have passed along it to the said perfection of love, as it sings in this first stanza, calling this straight road with full propriety dark night, as will be explained hereafter in the lines of the said stanza. The soul then, rejoicing at having passed along this narrow road whence so many blessings have come to it, speaks after this manner. Book the first, which treats of the night of sense. Stanza the first. On a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings. Oh, happy chance. I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest. Exposition. In this first stanza, the soul relates the way and manner which it followed in going forth, as to its affection, from itself and from all things, and in dying to them all and to itself, by means of true mortification, in order to attain to living the sweet and delectable life of love with God. And it says that this going forth from itself and from all things was a dark night, by which, as will be explained hereafter, is here understood purgative contemplation, which causes passively in the soul the negation of itself and of all things referred to above. And this going forth it says here that it was able to accomplish in the strength and ardour which love for its spouse gave to it for that purpose, in the dark contemplation aforementioned. Herein it extols the great happiness which it found in journeying to God through this night with such signal success that none of the three enemies, which are world, devil and flesh, who are they that ever impede this road, could hinder it. Inasmuch as the aforementioned night of purgative contemplation lulled to sleep and mortified, in the house of its sensuality, all the passions and desires with respect to their mischievous desires and motions. The line, then, says, on a dark night. Chapter 1 sets down the first line and begins to treat of the imperfections of beginners. Into this dark night souls begin to enter when God draws them forth from the state of beginners, which is the state of those that meditate on the spiritual road, and begins to set them in the state of progressives, which is that of those who are already contemplatives, to the end that, after passing through it, they may arrive at the state of the perfect, which is that of the divine union of the soul with God. Wherefore, to the end that we may the better understand and explain what night is this through which the soul passes, and for what cause God sets it therein, it will be well here to touch first of all upon certain characteristics of beginners, which, although we treat them with all possible brevity, will not fail to be of service, likewise to the beginners themselves, in order that, realizing the weakness of the state wherein they are, they may take courage, and may desire that God will bring them into this night, wherein the soul is strengthened and confirmed in the virtues, and made ready for the inestimable delights of the love of God. And, although we may tarry here for a time, it will not be for longer than is necessary, so that we may go on to speak at once of this dark night. It must be known, then, that the soul, after it has been definitely converted to the service of God, is, as a rule, spiritually nurtured and caressed by God, even as is the tender child by its loving mother, who warms it with the heat of her bosom, and nurtures it with sweet milk and soft and pleasant food, and carries it and caresses it in her arms. But, as the child grows bigger, the mother gradually ceases caressing it, and, hiding her tender love, puts bitter aloes upon her sweet breast, sets down the child from her arms, and makes it walk upon its feet, so that it may lose the habits of a child and betake itself to more important and substantial occupations. The loving mother is like the grace of God, for, as soon as the soul is regenerated by its new warmth and fervor for the service of God, he treats it in the same way. He makes it to find spiritual milk, sweet and delectable, in all the things of God, without any labor of its own, and also great pleasure in spiritual exercises, for here God is giving to it the breast of his tender love, even as to a tender child. And for, such a soul finds its delight in spending long periods, perchance whole nights, in prayer. Penances are its pleasures, fasts its joys, and its consolations are to make use of the sacraments and to occupy itself in divine things, in the which things spiritual persons, though taking part in them, with great efficacy and persistence, and using and treating them with great care, often find themselves, spiritually speaking, very weak and imperfect. For since they are moved to these things, and to these spiritual exercises by the consolation and pleasure that they find in them, and since, too, they have not been prepared for them by the practice of earnest striving in the virtues, they have many faults and imperfections with respect to these spiritual actions of theirs. For, after all, any man's actions correspond to the habit of perfection attained by him. And, as these persons have not had the opportunity of acquiring the said habits of strength, they have necessarily to work like feebler children, feebly, in order that this may be seen more clearly, and likewise how much these beginners in the virtues lacks with respect to the works in which they so readily engage with the pleasure aforementioned. We shall describe it by reference to the 7 capital sins, each in its turn, indicating some of the many imperfections which they have under each heading, wherein it will be clearly seen how like to children are these persons in all they do. And it will also be seen how many blessings the dark night of which we shall afterwards treat brings with it, since it cleanses the soul and purifies it from all these imperfections. Chapter 2 Of certain spiritual imperfections which beginners have with respect to the habit of pride. As these beginners feel themselves to be very fervent and diligent in spiritual things and devout exercises, from this prosperity, although it is true that holy things of their own nature cause humility, there often comes to them, through their imperfections, a certain kind of secret pride, whence they come to have some degree of satisfaction with their works and with themselves. And hence there comes to them likewise a certain desire, which is somewhat vain, and at times very vain, to speak of spiritual things in the presence of others, and sometimes even to teach such things, rather than to learn them. They condemn others in their heart when they see that they have not the kind of devotion which they themselves desire. And sometimes they even say this in words, herein resembling the Pharisee, who boasted of himself, praising God for his own good works, and despising the publican. In these persons the devil often increases the fervor that they have, and the desire to perform these and other works more frequently, so that their pride and presumption may grow greater. For the devil knows quite well that all these works and virtues which they perform are not only valueless to them, but even become vices in them. And such a degree of evil are some of these persons wont to reach, that they would have none appear good save themselves. And thus, in deed and word, whenever the opportunity occurs, they condemn them and slander them, beholding the mote in their brother's eye, and not considering the beam which is in their own. They strain at another's gnat, and themselves swallow a camel. Sometimes, too, when their spiritual masters, such as confessors and superiors, do not approve of their spirit and behavior, for they are anxious that all they do shall be esteemed and praised, they consider that they do not understand them, or that, because they do not approve of this and comply with that, their confessors are themselves not spiritual, and so they immediately desire and contrive to find someone else who will fit in with their tastes. For as a rule they desire to speak of spiritual matters with those who they think will praise and esteem what they do, and they flee, as they would from death, from those who disabuse them in order to lead them into a safe road. Sometimes they even harbor ill will against them. Presuming thus, they are wont to resolve much and accomplish very little. Sometimes they are anxious that others shall realize how spiritual and devout they are, to which end they occasionally give outward evidence thereof in movements, sighs, and other ceremonies. And at times they are apt to fall into certain ecstasies, in public rather than in secret, wherein the devil aids them. And they are pleased that this should be noticed, and are often eager that it should be noticed more. Many such persons desire to be the favorites of their confessors, and to become intimate with them, as a result of which there beset them continual occasions of envy and disquiet. They are too much embarrassed to confess their sins nakedly, lest their confessors should think less of them, so they palliate them and make them appear less evil, and thus it is to excuse themselves, rather than to accuse themselves, that they go to confession. And sometimes they seek another confessor to tell the wrongs that they have done, so that their own confessor shall think they have done nothing wrong at all, but only good. And thus they always take pleasure in telling him what is good, and sometimes in such terms as make it appear to be greater than it is, rather than less, desiring that he may think them to be good, when it would be greater humility in them, as we shall say, to depreciate it, and to desire that neither he nor anyone else should consider them of account. Some of these beginners, too, make little of their faults, and at other times become over sad when they see themselves fall into them, thinking themselves to have been saints already. And thus they become angry and impatient with themselves, which is another imperfection. Often they beseech God, with great yearnings, that he will take from them their imperfections and faults. But they do this, that they may find themselves at peace, and may not be troubled by them, rather than for God's sake, not realizing that, if he should take their imperfections from them, they would probably become prouder and more presumptuous still. They dislike praising others, and love to be praised themselves. Sometimes they seek out such praise. Herein they are like the foolish virgins, who, when their lamps could not be lit, sought oil from others. From these imperfections some souls go on to develop many very grave ones, which do them great harm. But some have fewer, and some more, and some only the first motions thereof, or little beyond these. And there are hardly any such beginners who, at the time of these signs of fervor, fall not into some of these errors. But those who at this time are going on to perfection proceed very differently, and with quite another temper of spirit. For they progress by means of humility, and are greatly edified, not only thinking naught of their own affairs, but having very little satisfaction with themselves. They consider all others as far better, and usually have a holy envy of them, and an eagerness to serve God as they do. For the greater is their fervor, and the more numerous are the works that they perform, and the greater is the pleasure that they take in them. As they progress in humility, the more do they realize how much God deserves of them, and how little is all that they do for His sake. And thus, the more they do, the less are they satisfied. So much would they gladly do from charity and love for Him, that all they do seems to them naught. And so greatly are they importuned, occupied, and absorbed by this loving anxiety that they never notice what others do or do not. Or if they do notice it, they always believe, as I say, that all others are far better than they themselves. Wherefore, holding themselves as of little worth, they are anxious that others too should thus hold them, and should despise and depreciate that which they do. And further, if men should praise and esteem them, they can in no wise believe what they say. It seems to them strange that anyone should say these good things of them. Together with great tranquility and humbleness, these souls have a deep desire to be taught by anyone who can bring them profit. They are the complete opposite of those of whom we have spoken above, who would fain be always teaching, and who, when others seem to be teaching them, take the words from their mouths as if they knew them already. These souls, on the other hand, being far from desiring to be the masters of any, are very ready to travel and set out on another road than that which they are actually following, if they be so commanded, because they never think that they are right in anything whatsoever. They rejoice when others are praised. They grieve only because they serve not God like them. They have no desire to speak of the things that they do, because they think so little of them that they are ashamed to speak of them even to their spiritual masters, since they seem to them to be things that merit not being spoken of. They are more anxious to speak of their faults and sins, or that these should be recognized rather than their virtues. And thus they incline to talk of their souls with those who account their actions and their spirituality of little value. This is a characteristic of the spirit which is simple, pure, genuine, and very pleasing to God. For as the wise Spirit of God dwells in these humble souls, He moves them and inclines them to keep His treasures secretly within, and likewise to cast out from themselves all evil. God gives this grace to the humble, together with the other virtues, even as He denies it to the proud. These souls will give their heart's blood to anyone that serves God, and will help others to serve Him as much as in them lies. The imperfections into which they see themselves fall, they bear with humility, meekness of spirit, and a loving fear of God, hoping in Him. But souls who in the beginning journey with this kind of perfection are, as I understand, and as has been said, a minority, and very few are those who we can be glad do not fall into the opposite errors. For this reason, as we shall afterwards say, God leads into the dark night those whom He desires to purify from all these imperfections, so that He may bring them farther onward. Chapter 3. Of some imperfections which some of these souls are apt to have, with respect to the second capital sin, which is avarice, in the spiritual sense. Many of these beginners have also at times great spiritual avarice. They will be found to be discontented with the spirituality which God gives them. And they are very disconsolate and querulous, because they find not in spiritual things the consolation that they would desire. Many can never have enough of listening to counsels and learning spiritual precepts, and of possessing and reading many books which treat of this matter, and they spend their time on all these things, rather than on works of mortification and the perfecting of the inward poverty of spirit, which should be theirs. Furthermore, they burden themselves with images and rosaries which are very curious. Now they put down one, now take up another. Now they change about, now change back again. Now they want this kind of thing, now that, preferring one kind of cross to another, because it is more curious. And others you will see adorned with Agnus Deius and relics and tokens, like children with trinkets. Here I condemn the attachment of the heart, and the affection which they have for the nature, multitude, and curiosity of these things, inasmuch as it is quite contrary to poverty of spirit, which considers only the substance of devotion, makes use only of what suffices for that end, and grows weary of this other kind of multiplicity and curiosity. For true devotion must issue from the heart, and consist in the truth and substances alone of what is represented by spiritual things. All the rest is affection and attachment proceeding from imperfection. And in order that one may pass to any kind of perfection, it is necessary for such desires to be killed. I knew a person who for more than 10 years made use of a cross, roughly formed from a branch that had been blessed, fastened with a pin twisted round it. He had never ceased using it, and he always carried it about with him, until I took it from him. And this was a person of no small sense and understanding. And I saw another who said his prayers using beads that were made of bones from the spine of a fish. His devotion was certainly no less precious on that account in the sight of God, for it is clear that these things carried no devotion in their workmanship or value. Those, then, who start from these beginnings and make good progress, attach themselves to no visible instruments, nor do they burden themselves with such, nor desire to know more than is necessary, in order that they may act well. For they set their eyes only on being right with God and on pleasing Him, and therein consists their covetousness. And thus, with great generosity, they give away all that they have, and delight to know that they have it not, for God's sake and for charity to their neighbor, no matter whether these be spiritual things or temporal. For, as I say, they set their eyes only upon the reality of interior perfection, which is to give pleasure to God and in naught to give pleasure to themselves. But neither from these imperfections nor from those others can the soul be perfectly purified until God brings it into the passive purgation of that dark night, whereof we shall speak presently. It befits the soul, however, to contrive to labor, in so far as it can, on its own account, to the end that it may purge and perfect itself, and thus may merit being taken by God into that divine care, wherein it becomes healed of all things that it was unable of itself to cure. Because, however greatly the soul itself labors, it cannot actively purify itself so as to be in the least degree prepared for the divine union of perfection, of love, if God takes not its hand and purges it not in that dark fire, in the way and manner that we have to describe. Chapter 4. Of other imperfections which these beginners are apt to have with respect to the third sin, which is luxury. Many of these beginners have many other imperfections than those which I am describing with respect to each of the deadly sins, but these I set aside, in order to avoid prolixity, touching upon a few of the most important, which are, as it were, the origin and cause of the rest. And thus, with respect to this sin of luxury, leaving apart the falling of spiritual persons into this sin, since my intent is to treat of the imperfections which have to be purged by the dark night, they have many imperfections which might be described as spiritual luxury, not because they are so, but because the imperfections proceed from spiritual things. For it often comes to pass that, in their very spiritual exercises, when they are powerless to prevent it, there arise and assert themselves in the sensual part of the soul impure acts and motions, and sometimes this happens even when the spirit is deep in prayer, or engaged in the sacrament of penance, or in the Eucharist. These things are not, as I say, in their power. They proceed from one of three causes. The first cause from which they often proceed is the pleasure which human nature takes in spiritual things. For when the spirit and the sense are pleased, every part of a man is moved by that pleasure to delight according to its proportion and nature. For then the spirit, which is the higher part, is moved to pleasure and delight in God. And the sensual nature, which is the lower part, is moved to pleasure and delight of the senses, because it cannot possess and lay hold upon aught else, and it therefore lays hold upon that which comes nearest to itself, which is the impure and sensual. Thus it comes to pass that the soul is in deep prayer with God according to the Spirit, and, on the other hand, according to sense, it is passively conscious, not without great displeasure, of rebellions and motions and acts of the senses, which often happens in communion. For when the soul receives joy and comfort in this act of love, because this Lord bestows it, since it is to that end that He gives Himself, the sensual nature takes that which is its own likewise, as we have said, after its manner. Now as, after all, these two parts are combined in one individual, they ordinarily both participate in that which one of them receives, each after its manner. For, as the philosopher says, everything that is received is in the recipient after the manner of the same recipient. And thus, in these beginnings, and even when the soul has made some progress, its sensual part, being imperfect, oftentimes receives the Spirit of God with the same imperfection. Now, when this sensual part is renewed by the purgation of the dark night, which we shall describe, it no longer has these weaknesses. For it is no longer this part that receives aught, but rather it is itself received into the Spirit. And thus it then has everything after the manner of the Spirit. The second cause whence these rebellions sometimes proceed is the devil, who, in order to disquiet and disturb the soul, at times when it is at prayer or is striving to pray, contrives to stir up these motions of impurity in its nature. And if the soul gives heed to any of these, they cause it great harm. For through fear of these, not only do persons become lax in prayer, which is the aim of the devil when he begins to strive with them, but some give up prayer altogether, because they think that these things attack them more during that exercise than apart from it. Which is true, since the devil attacks them then more than at other times, so that they may give up spiritual exercises. And not only so, but he succeeds in portraying to them very vividly things that are most foul and impure, and at times are very closely related to certain spiritual things and persons that are of profit to their souls, in order to terrify them and make them fearful, so that those who are affected by this dare not even look at anything or meditate upon anything, because they immediately encounter this temptation. And upon those who are inclined to melancholy, this acts with such effect that they become greatly to be pitied, since they are suffering so sadly. For this trial reaches such a point in certain persons, when they have this evil humor, that they believe it to be clear that the devil is ever present with them, and that they have no power to prevent this, although some of these persons can prevent his attack by dint of great effort and labor. When these impurities attack such souls through the medium of melancholy, they are not as a rule freed from them until they have been cured of that kind of humor, unless the dark night has entered the soul and rids them of all impurities, one after another. The third source, whence these impure motions are apt to proceed in order to make war upon the soul, is often the fear which such persons have conceived for these impure representations and motions. Something that they see or say or think brings them to their mind, and this makes them afraid, so that they suffer from them through no fault of their own. There are also certain souls of so tender and frail a nature that, when there comes to them some spiritual consolation or some grace in prayer, the spirit of luxury is with them immediately, inebriating and delighting their sensual nature in such manner that it is as if they were plunged into the enjoyment and pleasure of this sin. And the enjoyment remains, together with the consolation, passively, and sometimes they are able to see that certain impure and unruly acts have taken place. The reason for this is that, since these natures are, as I say, frail and tender, their humors are stirred up, and their blood is excited at the least disturbance, and hence come these motions. And the same thing happens to such souls when they are enkindled with anger or suffer any disturbance or grief. Sometimes, again, there arises within these spiritual persons, whether they be speaking or performing spiritual actions, a certain vigor and bravado, through their having regard to persons who are present, and before these persons they display a certain kind of vain gratification. This also arises from luxury of spirit, after the manner wherein we here understand it, which is accompanied as a rule by complacency in the will. Some of these persons make friendships of a spiritual kind with others, which oftentimes arise from luxury and not from spirituality. This may be known to be the case when the remembrance of that friendship causes not the remembrance and love of God to grow, but occasions remorse of conscience. For, when the friendship is purely spiritual, the love of God grows with it. And the more the soul remembers it, the more it remembers the love of God, and the greater the desire it has for God. So that, as the one grows, the other grows also. For the Spirit of God has this property, that it increases good by adding to it more good, inasmuch as there is likeness and conformity between them. But, when this love arises from the vice of sensuality aforementioned, it produces the contrary effects. For the more the one grows, the more the other decreases, and the remembrance of it likewise. If that sensual love grows, it will at once be observed that the soul's love of God is becoming colder, and that it is forgetting Him as it remembers that love. There comes to it, too, a certain remorse of conscience, and, on the other hand, If the love of God grows in the soul, that other love becomes cold and is forgotten. For, as the two are contrary to one another, not only does the one not aid the other, but the one which predominates quenches and confounds the other, and becomes strengthened in itself, as the philosophers say. Wherefore, our Saviour said in the Gospel, "That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit." That is to say, the love which is born of sensuality ends in sensuality, and that which is of the Spirit ends in the Spirit of God and causes it to grow. This is the difference that exists between these two kinds of love, whereby we may know them. When the soul enters the dark night, it brings these kinds of love under control. It strengthens and purifies the one, namely that which is according to God, and the other it removes and brings to an end. And in the beginning, it causes both to be lost sight of, as we shall say hereafter. Chapter 5. Of the imperfections into which beginners fall with respect to the sin of wrath. By reason of the concupiscence which many beginners have for spiritual consolations. Their experience of these consolations is very commonly accompanied by many imperfections proceeding from the sin of wrath. For, when their delight and pleasure in spiritual things come to an end, they naturally become embittered, and bear that lack of sweetness which they have to suffer with a bad grace, which affects all that they do. And they very easily become irritated over the smallest matter. Sometimes, indeed, none can tolerate them. This frequently happens after they have been very pleasantly recollected in prayer according to sense. When their pleasure and delight therein come to an end, their nature is naturally vexed and disappointed, just as is the child when they take it from the breast, of which it was enjoying the sweetness. There is no sin in this natural vexation, when it is not permitted to indulge itself, but only imperfection, which must be purged by the aridity and severity of the dark night. There are other of these spiritual persons, again, who fall into another kind of spiritual wrath. This happens when they become irritated at the sins of others, and keep watch on those others, with a sort of uneasy zeal. At times the impulse comes to them to reprove them angrily, and occasionally they go so far as to indulge it and set themselves up as masters of virtue. All this is contrary to spiritual meekness. There are others who are vexed with themselves when they observe their own imperfectness, and display an impatience that is not humility. So impatient are they about this, that they would fain be saints in a day. Many of these persons purpose to accomplish a great deal and make grand resolutions. Yet, as they are not humble and have no misgivings about themselves, the more resolutions they make, the greater is their fall, and the greater their annoyance, since they have not the patience to wait for that which God will give them when it pleases Him. This likewise is contrary to the spiritual meekness aforementioned, which cannot be wholly remedied save by the purgation of the dark night. Some souls, on the other hand, are so patient as regards the progress which they desire that God would gladly see them less so. Chapter 6. Of imperfections with respect to spiritual gluttony. With respect to the fourth sin, which is spiritual gluttony, there is much to be said, for there is scarce one of these beginners who, however satisfactory his progress, falls not into some of the many imperfections which come to these beginners with respect to this sin, on account of the sweetness which they find at first in spiritual exercises. For many of these, lured by the sweetness and pleasure which they find in such exercises, strive more after spiritual sweetness than after spiritual purity and discretion, which is that which God regards and accepts throughout the spiritual journey. Therefore, besides the imperfections into which the seeking for sweetness of this kind makes them fall, the gluttony which they now have makes them continually go to extremes, so that they pass beyond the limits of moderation within which the virtues are acquired and wherein they have their being. For some of these persons, attracted by the pleasure which they find therein, kill themselves with penances, and others weaken themselves with fasts, by performing more than their frailty can bear, without the order or advice of any, but rather endeavoring to avoid those whom they should obey in these matters. Some, indeed, dare to do these things, even though the contrary has been commanded them. These persons are most imperfect and unreasonable. for they set bodily penance before subjection and obedience, which is penance according to reason and discretion, and therefore a sacrifice more acceptable and pleasing to God than any other. But such one-sided penance is no more than the penance of beasts, to which they are attracted, exactly like beasts, by the desire and pleasure which they find therein. Inasmuch as all extremes are vicious, and as in behaving thus such persons are working their own will, they grow in vice rather than in virtue. For, to say the least, they are acquiring spiritual gluttony and pride in this way, through not walking in obedience. And many of these the devil assails, stirring up this gluttony in them through the pleasures and desires which he increases within them, to such an extent that, since they can no longer help themselves, they either change or vary, or add to that which is commanded them, as any obedience in this respect is so bitter to them. To such an evil pass have some persons come that, simply because it is through obedience that they engage in these exercises, they lose the desire and devotion to perform them, their only desire and pleasure being to do what they themselves are inclined to do, so that it would probably be more profitable for them not to engage in these exercises at all. You will find that many of these persons are very insistent with their spiritual masters to be granted that which they desire, extracting it from them almost by force. If they be refused it, they become as peevish as children, and go about in great displeasure, thinking that they are not serving God when they are not allowed to do that which they would. For they go about clinging to their own will and pleasure, which they treat as though it came from God. And immediately their directors take it from them, and try to subject them to the will of God. They become peevish, grow faint-hearted, and fall away. These persons think that their own satisfaction and pleasure are the satisfaction and service of God. There are others, again, who, because of this gluttony, know so little of their own unworthiness and misery, and have thrust so far from them the loving fear and reverence which they owe to the greatness of God, that they hesitate not to insist continually that their confessors shall allow them to communicate often. And, what is worse, they frequently dare to communicate without the leave and consent of the minister and steward of Christ, merely acting on their own opinion, and contriving to conceal the truth from him. And for this reason, because they desire to communicate continually, they make their confessions carelessly, being more eager to eat than to eat cleanly and perfectly, although it would be healthier and holier for them had they the contrary inclination, and begged their confessors not to command them to approach the altar so frequently. Between these two extremes, however, the better way is that of humble resignation. But the boldness referred to is a thing that does great harm, and men may fear to be punished for such temerity. These persons, in communicating, strive with every nerve to obtain some kind of sensible sweetness and pleasure, instead of humbly doing reverence and giving praise within themselves to God. And in such wise do they devote themselves to this that, when they have received no pleasure or sweetness in the senses, they think that they have accomplished nothing at all. This is to judge God very unworthily. They have not realized that the least of the benefits which come from this most holy sacrament is that which concerns the senses, and that the invisible part of the grace that it bestows is much greater. For, in order that they may look at it with the eyes of faith, God oftentimes withholds from them these other consolations and sweetnesses of sense, and thus they desire to feel and taste God as though he were comprehensible by them and accessible to them. Not only in this, but likewise in other spiritual practices. All this is very great imperfection and completely opposed to the nature of God, since it is impurity in faith. These persons have the same defect as regards the practice of prayer, for they think that all the business of prayer consists in experiencing sensible pleasure and devotion, and they strive to obtain this by great effort, wearying and fatiguing their faculties and their heads. And when they have not found this pleasure, they become greatly discouraged, thinking that they have accomplished nothing. Through these efforts they lose true devotion and spirituality, which consist in perseverance, together with patience and humility and mistrust of themselves, that they may please God alone. For this reason, when they have once failed to find pleasure in this or some other exercise, they have great disinclination and repugnance to return to it, and at times they abandon it. They are, in fact, as we have said, like children, who are not influenced by reason, and who act not from rational motives, but from inclination. Such persons expend all their effort in seeking spiritual pleasure and consolation. They never tire, therefore, of reading books. And they begin, now one meditation, now another, in their pursuit of this pleasure, which they desire to experience in the things of God. But God, very justly, wisely and lovingly, denies it to them. For otherwise this spiritual gluttony and inordinate appetite would breed innumerable evils. It is, therefore, very fitting that they should enter into the dark night, whereof we shall speak, that they may be purged from this childishness. These persons who are thus inclined to such pleasures have another very great imperfection, which is that they are very weak and remiss in journeying upon the hard road of the cross. For the soul that is given to sweetness naturally has its face set against all self-denial, which is devoid of sweetness. These persons have many other imperfections which arise hence, of which in time the Lord heals them by means of temptations, aridities, and other trials, all of which are part of the dark night. All these I will not treat further here, lest I become too lengthy. I will only say that spiritual temperance and sobriety lead to another and a very different temper, which is that of mortification, fear, and submission in all things. It thus becomes clear that the perfection and worth of things consist not in the multitude and the pleasantness of one's actions, but in being able to deny oneself in them. This such persons must endeavor to compass, in so far as they may, until God is pleased to purify them indeed, by bringing them into the dark night, to arrive at which I am hastening on with my account of these imperfections. Chapter 7. Of imperfections with respect to spiritual envy and sloth, with respect likewise to the other two vices, which are spiritual envy and sloth. These beginners fail not to have many imperfections. For, with respect to envy, many of them are wont to experience movements of displeasure at the spiritual good of others, which cause them a certain sensible grief at being outstripped upon this road, so that they would prefer not to hear others praised. For they become displeased at others' virtues, and sometimes they cannot refrain from contradicting what is said in praise of them, depreciating it as far as they can. And their annoyance thereat grows because the same is not said of them, for they would fain be preferred in everything. All this is clean, contrary to charity, which, as St. Paul says, rejoices in goodness. And, if charity has any envy, it is a holy envy, comprising grief at not having the virtues of others, yet also joy because others have them, and delight when others outstrip us in the service of God, wherein we ourselves are so remiss. With respect also to spiritual sloth, beginners are apt to be irked by the things that are most spiritual, from which they flee because these things are incompatible with sensible pleasure. For, as they are so much accustomed to sweetness in spiritual things, they are wearied by things in which they find no sweetness. If once they fail to find in prayer the satisfaction which their taste required, and after all it is well that God should take it from them to prove them, they would prefer not to return to it. Sometimes they leave it. At other times they continue it unwillingly. And thus, because of this sloth, they abandon the way of perfection, which is the way of the negation of their will and pleasure for God's sake. For the pleasure and sweetness of their own will, which they aim at satisfying in this way rather than the will of God. And many of these would have God will that which they themselves will, and are fretful at having to will that which He wills, and find it repugnant to accommodate their will to that of God. Hence it happens to them that oftentimes they think that that wherein they find not their own will and pleasure is not the will of God. And that, on the other hand, when they themselves find satisfaction, God is satisfied. Thus they measure God by themselves and not themselves by God, acting quite contrarily to that which He Himself taught in the Gospel, saying, that he who should lose his will for His sake, the same should gain it. And he who should desire to gain it, the same should lose it. These persons likewise find it irksome when they are commanded to do that wherein they take no pleasure. Because they aim at spiritual sweetness and consolation, they are too weak to have the fortitude and bear the trials of perfection. They resemble those who are softly nurtured and who run fretfully away from everything that is hard and take offense at the cross, wherein consist the delights of the Spirit. The more spiritual a thing is, the more irksome they find it. For, as they seek to go about spiritual matters with complete freedom and according to the inclination of their will, it causes them great sorrow and repugnance to enter upon the narrow way, which, says Christ, is the way of life. Let it suffice here to have described these imperfections, among the many to be found in the lives of those that are in this first state of beginners, so that it may be seen how greatly they need God to set them in the state of proficience. This he does by bringing them into the dark night whereof we now speak, wherein he weans them from the breasts of these sweetnesses and pleasures, gives them pure aridities and inward darkness, takes from them all these irrelevancies and puerilities, and by very different means causes them to win the virtues. For, however assiduously the beginner practices the mortification in himself of all these actions and passions of his, he can never completely succeed. Very far from it, until God shall work it in him passively by means of the purgation of the said night. Of this I would fain speak in some way that may be profitable. May God, then, be pleased to give me his divine light, because this is very needful in a night that is so dark, and a matter that is so difficult to describe and to expound. The line, then, is, in a dark night. Chapter 8, wherein is expounded the first line of the first stanza, and a beginning is made of the explanation of this dark night. This night, which, as we say, is contemplation, produces in spiritual persons two kinds of darkness or purgation, corresponding to the two parts of man's nature, namely, the sensual and the spiritual. And thus the one night or purgation will be sensual, wherein the soul is purged according to sense, which is subdued to the spirit. And the other is a night or purgation, which is spiritual, wherein the soul is purged and stripped according to the spirit, and subdued and made ready for the union of love with God. The night of sense is common and comes to many. These are the beginners. And of this night we shall speak first. The night of the spirit is the portion of very few, and these are they that are already practiced and proficient, of whom we shall treat hereafter. The first purgation or night is bitter and terrible to sense, as we shall now show. The second bears no comparison with it, for it is horrible and awful to the spirit, as we shall show presently. Since the night of sense is first in order and comes first, we shall first of all say something about it briefly, since more is written of it, as of a thing that is more common. And we shall pass on to treat more fully of the spiritual night, since very little has been said of this, either in speech or in writing, and very little is known of it, even by experience. Since then, the conduct of these beginners upon the way of God is ignoble, and has much to do with their love of self and their own inclinations. As has been explained above, God desires to lead them farther. He seeks to bring them out of that ignoble kind of love to a higher degree of love for Him, to free them from the ignoble exercises of sense and meditation, wherewith, as we have said, they go seeking God so unworthily, and in so many ways that are unbefitting, and to lead them to a kind of spiritual exercise wherein they can commune with Him more abundantly and are freed more completely from imperfections. For they have now had practice for some time in the way of virtue and have persevered in meditation and prayer, whereby, through the sweetness and pleasure that they have found therein, they have lost their love of the things of the world and have gained some degree of spiritual strength in God. This has enabled them to some extent to refrain from creature desires, so that for God's sake they are now able to suffer a light burden and a little aridity, without turning back to a time which they found more pleasant. When they are going about these spiritual exercises with the greatest delight and pleasure, and when they believe that the sun of divine favor is shining most brightly upon them, God turns all this light of theirs into darkness, and shuts against them the door and the source of the sweet spiritual water which they were tasting in God whensoever and for as long as they desired. For, as they were weak and tender, there was no door closed to them, as St. John says in the Apocalypse, Itzi, and thus he leaves them so completely in the dark that they know not whither to go with their sensible imagination and meditation. For they cannot advance a step in meditation, as they were wont to do aforetime, their inward senses being submerged in this night, and left with such dryness, that not only do they experience no pleasure and consolation in the spiritual things, and good exercises, wherein they were wont to find their delights and pleasures. But instead, on the contrary, they find insipidity and bitterness in the said things. For, as I have said, God now sees that they have grown a little, and are becoming strong enough to lay aside their swaddling clothes and be taken from the gentle breast. So he sets them down from his arms and teaches them to walk on their own feet, which they feel to be very strange, for everything seems to be going wrong with them. To recollected persons this commonly happens sooner after their beginnings than to others, inasmuch as they are freer from occasions of backsliding, and their desires turn more quickly from the things of the world, which is necessary if they are to begin to enter this blessed night of sense. Ordinarily no great time passes after their beginnings before they begin to enter this night of sense. And the great majority of them do in fact enter it, for they will generally be seen to fall into these aridities. With regard to this way of purgation of the senses, since it is so common, we might here adduce a great number of quotations from divine scripture, where many passages relating to it are continually found, particularly in the Psalms and the prophets. However, I do not wish to spend time upon these, for he who knows not how to look for them, there will find the common experience of this purgation to be sufficient. Chapter 9. Of the signs by which it will be known that the spiritual person is walking along the way of this night and purgation of sense. But since these aridities might frequently proceed, not from the night and purgation of the sensual desires aforementioned, but from sins and imperfections, or from weakness and lukewarmness, or from some bad humor or indisposition of the body, I shall here set down certain signs by which it may be known if such aridity proceeds from the aforementioned purgation, or if it arises from any of the aforementioned sins. For the making of this distinction, I find that there are three principal signs. The first is whether, when a soul finds no pleasure or consolation in the things of God, it also fails to find it in anything created. For, as God sets the soul in this dark night to the end, that he may quench and purge its sensual desire, he allows it not to find attraction or sweetness in anything whatsoever. In such a case, it may be considered very probable that this aridity and insipidity proceed not from recently committed sins or imperfections. For, if this were so, the soul would feel in its nature some inclination or desire to taste other things than those of God. Since, whenever the desire is allowed indulgence in any imperfection, it immediately feels inclined thereto, whether little or much, in proportion to the pleasure and the love that it has put into it. Since, however, this lack of enjoyment in things above or below might proceed from some indisposition or melancholy humor, which oftentimes makes it impossible for the soul to take pleasure in anything, it becomes necessary to apply the second sign and condition. The second sign whereby a man may believe himself to be experiencing the said purgation is that the memory is ordinarily centered upon God, with painful care and solicitude, thinking that it is not serving God, but is backsliding, because it finds itself without sweetness in the things of God. And in such a case, it is evident that this lack of sweetness and this aridity come not from weakness and lukewarmness. For it is the nature of lukewarmness not to care greatly, or to have any inward solicitude for the things of God. There is thus a great difference between aridity and lukewarmness. For lukewarmness consists in great weakness and remissness in the will and in the spirit, without solicitude as to serving God. Whereas purgative aridity is ordinarily accompanied by solicitude, with care and grief, as I say, because the soul is not serving God. And, although this may sometimes be increased by melancholy or some other humor, as it frequently is, it fails not for that reason to produce a purgative effect upon the desire, since the desire is deprived of all pleasure and has its care centered upon God alone. For, when mere humor is the cause, it spends itself in displeasure and ruin of the physical nature, and there are none of those desires to sense God which belong to purgative aridity. When the cause is aridity, it is true that the sensual part of the soul has fallen low and is weak and feeble in its actions, by reason of the little pleasure which it finds in them. But the spirit, on the other hand, is ready and strong. For the cause of this aridity is that God transfers to the spirit the good things and the strength of the senses, which, since the soul's natural strength and senses are incapable of using them, remain barren, dry and empty, For the sensual part of a man has no capacity for that which is pure spirit, and thus, when it is the spirit that receives the pleasure, the flesh is left without savour and is too weak to perform any action. But the spirit, which all the time is being fed, goes forward in strength, and with more alertness and solicitude than before, in its anxiety not to fail God. And if it is not immediately conscious of spiritual sweetness and delight, but only of aridity and lack of sweetness, the reason for this is the strangeness of the exchange. For its palate has been accustomed to those other sensual pleasures upon which its eyes are still fixed, and, since the spiritual palate is not made ready or purged for such subtle pleasure, until it finds itself becoming prepared for it by means of this arid and dark night, it cannot experience spiritual pleasure and good, but only aridity and lack of sweetness, since it misses the pleasure which aforetime it enjoyed so readily. These souls, whom God is beginning to lead through these solitary places of the wilderness, are like to the children of Israel, to whom in the wilderness God began to give food from heaven, containing within itself all sweetness, and, as is there said, it turned to the savour which each one of them desired. But withal the children of Israel felt the lack of the pleasures and delights of the flesh and the onions which they had eaten aforetime in Egypt, the more so because their palate was accustomed to these and took delight in them, rather than in the delicate sweetness of the angelic manna. And they wept and sighed for the flesh pots, even in the midst of the food of heaven. To such depths does the vileness of our desires descend that it makes us to long for our own wretched food and to be nauseated by the indescribable blessings of heaven. But, as I say, when these aridities proceed from the way of the purgation of sensual desire, although at first the spirit feels no sweetness, for the reasons that we have just given, it feels that it is deriving strength and energy to act from the substance which this inward food gives it, the which food is the beginning of a contemplation that is dark and arid to the senses, which contemplation is secret and hidden from the very person that experiences it. And ordinarily, together with the aridity and emptiness which it causes in the senses, it gives the soul an inclination and desire to be alone and in quietness, without being able to think of any particular thing or having the desire to do so. If those souls to whom this comes to pass knew how to be quiet at this time, and troubled not about performing any kind of action, whether inward or outward, neither had any anxiety about doing anything, then they would delicately experience this inward refreshment in that ease and freedom from care. So delicate is this refreshment that ordinarily, if a man have desire or care to experience it, he experiences it not. For, as I say, it does its work when the soul is most at ease and freest from care. It is like the air, which, if one would close one's hand upon it, escapes. In this sense we may understand that which the spouse said to the bride in the songs, namely, "Withdraw thine eyes from me, for they make me to soar aloft." For in such a way does God bring the soul into this state, and by so different a path does he lead it that, if it desires to work with its faculties, it hinders the work which God is doing in it rather than aids it. Whereas aforetime, it was quite the contrary. The reason is that, in this state of contemplation, which the soul enters when it forsakes meditation for the state of the proficient, it is God who is now working in the soul. He binds its interior faculties, and allows it not to cling to the understanding, nor to have delight in the will, nor to reason with the memory. For anything that the soul can do of its own accord at this time serves only, as we have said, to hinder inward peace and the work which God is accomplishing in the spirit by means of that aridity of sense. And this peace, being spiritual and delicate, performs a work which is quiet and delicate, solitary, productive of peace and satisfaction, and far removed from all those earlier pleasures, which were very palpable and sensual. This is the peace which, says David, God speaks in the soul to the end that he may make it spiritual. And this leads us to the third point. The third sign whereby this purgation of sense may be recognized is that the soul can no longer meditate or reflect in the imaginative sphere of sense, as it was wont, however much it may of itself endeavor to do so. For God now begins to communicate himself to it, no longer through sense, as he did aforetime, by means of reflections which joined and sundered its knowledge, but by pure spirit, into which consecutive reflections enter not. but he communicates himself to it by an act of simple contemplation, to which neither the exterior nor the interior senses of the lower part of the soul can attain. From this time forward, therefore, imagination and fancy can find no support in any meditation, and can gain no foothold by means thereof. With regard to this third sign, it is to be understood that this embarrassment and dissatisfaction of the faculties proceed not from indisposition, for, when this is the case, and the indisposition, which never lasts for long, comes to an end, the soul is able once again, by taking some trouble about the matter, to do what it did before, and the faculties find their wonted support. But in the purgation of the desire this is not so. When once the soul begins to enter therein, its inability to reflect with the faculties grows ever greater. For, although it is true that at first, and with some persons, the process is not as continuous as this, so that occasionally they fail to abandon their pleasures and reflections of sense. For perchance, by reason of their weakness, it was not fitting to wean them from these immediately. Yet this inability grows within them more and more and brings the workings of sense to an end, if indeed they are to make progress. For those who walk not in the way of contemplation act very differently. For this night of aridities is not usually continuous in their senses. At times they have these aridities, at others they have them not. At times they cannot meditate, at others they can. For God sets them in this night only to prove them and to humble them, and to reform their desires, so that they go not nurturing in themselves a sinful gluttony in spiritual things. He sets them not there, in order to lead them in the way of the Spirit, which is this contemplation. For not all those who walk of set purpose in the way of the Spirit are brought by God to contemplation, nor even the half of them. Why? He best knows. And this is why he never completely weans the senses of such persons from the breasts of meditations and reflections, but only for short periods and at certain seasons, as we have said. Chapter 10. Of the way in which these souls are to conduct themselves in this dark night. During the time, then, of the aridities of this night of sense, wherein God effects the change, of which we have spoken above, drawing forth the soul from the life of sense into that of the Spirit, that is, from meditation to contemplation, wherein it no longer has any power to work or to reason with its faculties concerning the things of God. As has been said, spiritual persons suffer great trials, by reason not so much of the aridities which they suffer, as of the fear which they have of being lost on the road, thinking that all spiritual blessing is over for them, and that God has abandoned them, since they find no help or pleasure in good things. Then they grow weary, and endeavor, as they have been accustomed to do, to concentrate their faculties with some degree of pleasure upon some object of meditation, thinking that, when they are not doing this, and yet are conscious of making an effort, they are doing nothing. This effort they make not without great inward repugnance and unwillingness on the part of their soul, which was taking pleasure in being in that quietness and ease, instead of working with its faculties. So they have abandoned the one pursuit, yet draw no profit from the other. For, by seeking what is prompted by their own spirit, they lose the spirit of tranquility and peace which they had before. And thus they are like to one who abandons what he has done in order to do it over again, or to one who leaves a city only to re-enter it, or to one who is hunting and lets his prey go in order to hunt it once more. This is useless here, for the soul will gain nothing further by conducting itself in this way. As has been said, these souls turn back at such a time if there is none who understands them. They abandon the road or lose courage. Or, at the least, they are hindered from going farther by the great trouble which they take in advancing along the road of meditation and reasoning. Thus they fatigue and overwork their nature, imagining that they are failing through negligence or sin. But this trouble that they are taking is quite useless, for God is now leading them by another road, which is that of contemplation, and is very different from the first. For the one is of meditation and reasoning, and the other belongs neither to imagination nor yet to reasoning. It is well for those who find themselves in this condition to take comfort, to persevere in patience, and to be in no wise afflicted. Let them trust in God, who abandons not those that seek him with a simple and right heart, and will not fail to give them what is needful for the road, until he bring them into the clear and pure light of love. This last he will give them by means of that other dark night, that of the Spirit, if they merit his bringing them thereto. The way in which they are to conduct themselves in this night of sense is to devote themselves not at all to reasoning and meditation, since this is not the time for it, but to allow the soul to remain in peace and quietness, although it may seem clear to them that they are doing nothing and are wasting their time. And although it may appear to them that it is because of their weakness that they have no desire in that state to think of anything, the truth is that they will be doing quite sufficient if they have patience and persevere in prayer without making any effort. What they must do is merely to leave the soul free and disencumbered and at rest from all knowledge and thought, troubling not themselves, in that state, about what they shall think or meditate upon, but contenting themselves with merely a peaceful and loving attentiveness toward God, and in being without anxiety, without the ability and without desire to have experience of him or to perceive him. For all these yearnings disquiet and distract the soul from the peaceful, quiet, and sweet ease of contemplation which is here granted to it. And although further scruples may come to them, that they are wasting their time, and that it would be well for them to do something else, because they can neither do nor think anything in prayer. Let them suffer these scruples and remain in peace, as there is no question save of their being at ease and having freedom of spirit. For if such a soul should desire to make any effort of its own with its interior faculties, this means that it will hinder and lose the blessings which, by means of that peace and ease of the soul, God is instilling into it and impressing upon it. It is just as if some painter were painting or dyeing a face. If the sitter were to move because he desired to do something, he would prevent the painter from accomplishing anything and would disturb him in what he was doing. And thus, when the soul desires to remain in inward ease and peace, any operation and affection or attentions wherein it may then seek to indulge will distract it and disquiet it, and make it conscious of aridity and emptiness of sense. For the more a soul endeavors to find support in affection and knowledge, the more will it feel the lack of these, which cannot now be supplied to it upon that road. Wherefore it behoves such a soul to pay no heed if the operations of its faculties become lost to it. It is rather to desire that this should happen quickly. For, by not hindering the operation of infused contemplation that God is bestowing upon it, it can receive this with more peaceful abundance, and cause its spirit to be enkindled, and to burn with the love which this dark and secret contemplation brings with it, and sets firmly in the soul. For contemplation is naught else than a secret, peaceful and loving infusion from God, which, if it be permitted, enkindles the soul with the spirit of love, according as the soul declares in the next lines, namely, kindled in love with yearnings. Chapter 11, wherein are expounded the 3 lines of the stanza. This enkindling of love is not as a rule felt at the first, because it has not begun to take hold upon the soul by reason of the impurity of human nature, or because the soul has not understood its own state, as we have said, and has therefore given it no peaceful abiding place within itself. Yet sometimes, nevertheless, there soon begins to make itself felt a certain yearning toward God. And the more this increases, the more is the soul affectioned and enkindled in love toward God. Without knowing or understanding how and whence this love and affection come to it, but from time to time seeing this flame and this enkindling grow so greatly within it that it desires God with yearning of love. Even as David, when he was in this dark night, said of himself in these words, namely, because my heart was enkindled, that is to say, in love of contemplation. My reins also were changed. That is, my desires for sensual affections were changed, namely from the way of sense to the way of the spirit, which is the aridity and cessation from all these things whereof we are speaking. And I, he says, was dissolved in nothing and annihilated, and I knew not. For, as we have said, without knowing the way whereby it goes, the soul finds itself annihilated with respect to all things above and below, which were accustomed to please it. And it finds itself enamored, without knowing how. And because at times the enkindling of love in the spirit grows greater, the yearnings for God become so great in the soul that the very bones seem to be dried up by this thirst, and the natural powers to be fading away, and their warmth and strength to be perishing through the intensity of the thirst of love. For the soul feels that this thirst of love is a living thirst. This thirst David had and felt when he said, "My soul thirsted for the living God," which is as much as to say, a living thirst was that of my soul. Of this thirst, since it is living, we may say that it kills. But it is to be noted that the vehemence of this thirst is not continuous, but occasional, although as a rule the soul is accustomed to feel it to a certain degree. But it must be noted that, as I began to say just now, this love is not as a rule felt at first, but only the dryness and emptiness are felt, whereof we are speaking. Then, in place of this love, which afterwards becomes gradually enkindled, what the soul experiences in the midst of these aridities and emptinesses of the faculties is an habitual care and solicitude with respect to God, together with grief and fear that it is not serving Him. But it is a sacrifice which is not a little pleasing to God, that the soul should go about afflicted and solicitous for His love. This solicitude and care leads the soul into that secret contemplation, until the senses, that is, the sensual part, having in course of time been in some degree purged of the natural affections and powers by means of the aridities which it causes within them, this divine love begins to be enkindled in the spirit. Meanwhile, however, like one who has begun a cure, the soul knows only suffering in this dark and arid purgation of the desire. By this means it becomes healed of many imperfections, and exercises itself in many virtues, in order to make itself meet for the said love. As we shall now say with respect to the line following. Oh, happy chance! When God leads the soul into this night of sense, in order to purge the sense of its lower part, and to subdue it, unite it, and bring it into conformity with the Spirit, by setting it in darkness, and causing it to cease from meditation, as He afterwards does, in order to purify the spirit, to unite it with God. As we shall afterwards say, He brings it into the night of the Spirit, and although it appears not so to it, the soul gains so many benefits that it holds it to be a happy chance to have escaped from the bonds and restrictions of the senses of or its lower self by means of this night aforesaid, and utters the present line, namely, "Oh, happy chance." With respect to this, it behoves us here to note the benefits which the soul finds in this night, and because of which it considers it a happy chance to have passed through it. All of which benefits the soul includes in the next line, namely, "I went forth without being observed." This going forth is understood of the subjection to its sensual part which the soul suffered when it sought God through operations so weak, so limited, and so defective as are those of this lower part. For at every step it stumbled into numerous imperfections and ignorances, as we have noted above in writing of the 7 capital sins. From all these it is freed when this night quenches within it all pleasures, whether from above or from below, and makes all meditation darkness to it, and grants it other innumerable blessings in the acquirement of the virtues, as we shall now show. For it will be a matter of great pleasure and great consolation, to one that journeys on this road, to see how that which seems to the soul so severe and adverse, and so contrary to spiritual pleasure, works in it so many blessings. These, as we say, are gained when the soul goes forth, as regards its affection and operation, by means of this night, from all created things, and when it journeys to eternal things, which is great happiness and good fortune. First, because of the great blessing which is in the quenching of the desire and affection with respect to all things. Secondly, because they are very few that endure and persevere in entering by this strait gate and by the narrow way which leads to life, as says our Saviour. The strait gate is this night of sense, and the soul detaches itself from sense and strips itself thereof, that it may enter by this gate, and establishes itself in faith, which is a stranger to all sense, so that afterwards it may journey by the narrow way, which is the other night, that of the Spirit. And this the soul afterwards enters in order in journey to God in pure faith, which is the means whereby the soul is united to God. By this road, since it is so narrow, dark, and terrible, though there is no comparison between this night of sense and that other, in its darkness and trials, as we shall say later, they are far fewer that journey, but its benefits are far greater without comparison than those of this present night. Of these benefits we shall now begin to say something with such brevity as is possible, in order that we may pass to the other night. Chapter 12. Of the benefits which this night causes in the soul, this night and purgation of the desire, a happy one for the soul, works in it so many blessings and benefits, although to the soul, as we have said, it rather seems that blessings are being taken away from it, that, even as Abraham made a great feast when he weaned his son Isaac, even so is there joy in heaven, because God is now taking this soul from its swaddling clothes, setting it down from his arms, making it to walk upon its feet, and likewise taking from it the milk of the breast and the soft and sweet food proper to children, and making it to eat bread with crust, and to begin to enjoy the food of robust persons. This food, in these aridities and this darkness of sense, is now given to the spirit, which is dry and emptied of all the sweetness of sense. And this food is the infused contemplation whereof we have spoken. This is the first and principal benefit caused by this arid and dark night of contemplation, the knowledge of oneself and of one's misery. For, besides the fact that all the favors which God grants to the soul are habitually granted to them enwrapped in this knowledge, these aridities and this emptiness of the faculties, compared with the abundance which the soul experienced aforetime, and the difficulty which it finds in good works, make it recognize its own lowliness and misery, which in the time of its prosperity it was unable to see. Of this there is a good illustration in the book of Exodus, where God, wishing to humble the children of Israel and desiring that they should know themselves, commanded them to take away and strip off the festal garments and adornments wherewith they were accustomed to adorn themselves in the wilderness, saying, "Now from henceforth strip yourselves of festal ornaments and put on everyday working dress, that ye may know what treatment ye deserve." This is as though he had said, "Inasmuch as the attire that ye wear, being proper to festival and rejoicing, causes you to feel less humble concerning yourselves than ye should, put off from you this attire, in order that henceforth, seeing yourselves clothed with vileness, ye may know that ye merit no more, and may know who ye are. Wherefore the soul knows the truth that it knew not at first, concerning its own misery. For, at the time when it was clad as for a festival, and found in God much pleasure, consolation, and support, it was somewhat more satisfied and contented, since it thought itself to some extent to be serving God. It is true that such souls may not have this idea explicitly in their minds, but some suggestion of it at least is implanted in them by the satisfaction which they find in their pleasant experiences. But, now that the soul has put on its other and working attire, that of aridity and abandonment, and now that its first lights have turned into darkness, it possesses these lights more truly in this virtue of self-knowledge, which is so excellent and so necessary, considering itself now as nothing, and experiencing no satisfaction in itself. For it sees that it does nothing of itself, neither can do anything, and the smallness of this self-satisfaction, together with the soul's affliction at not serving God, is considered and esteemed by God as greater than all the consolations which the soul formerly experienced and the works which it wrought, however great they were, inasmuch as they were the occasion of many imperfections and ignorances. And from this attire of aridity proceed, as from their fount and source of self-knowledge, not only the things which we have described already, but also the benefits which we shall now describe, and many more which will have to be omitted. In the first place, the soul learns to commune with God with more respect and more courtesy, such as a soul must ever observe in converse with the Most High. These it knew not in its prosperous times of comfort and consolation, for that comforting favor which it experienced made its craving for God somewhat bolder than was fitting, and discourteous and ill-considered. Even so did it happen to Moses, when he perceived that God was speaking to him. Blinded by that pleasure and desire, without further consideration, he would have made bold to go to him, if God had not commanded him to stay and put off his shoes. By this incident we are shown the respect and discretion in detachment of desire, wherewith a man is to commune with God. When Moses had obeyed in this matter, he became so discreet and so attentive that the scripture says that not only did he not make bold to draw near to God, but that he dared not even look at him. For, Having taken off the shoes of his desires and pleasures, he became very conscious of his wretchedness in the sight of God, as befitted one about to hear the word of God. Even so, likewise, the preparation which God granted to Job in order that he might speak with him consisted not in those delights and glories which Job himself reports that he was wont to have in his God, but in leaving him naked upon a dunghill, abandoned and even persecuted by his friends, filled with anguish and bitterness, and the earth covered with worms. And then the Most High God, he that lifts up the poor man from the dunghill, was pleased to come down and speak with him there face to face, revealing to him the depths and heights of his wisdom in a way that he had never done in the time of his prosperity. And here we must note another excellent benefit which there is in this night and aridity of the desire of sense, since we have had occasion to speak of it. It is that, in this dark night of the desire to the end, that the words of the prophet may be fulfilled, namely, "Thy light shall shine in the darkness." God will enlighten the soul, giving it knowledge, not only of its lowliness and wretchedness, as we have said, but likewise of the greatness and excellence of God. For, as well as quenching the desires and pleasures and attachments of sense, he cleanses and frees the understanding that it may understand the truth. For pleasure of sense and desire, even though it be for spiritual things, darkens and obstructs the spirit. And furthermore, that straightness and aridity of sense enlightens and quickens the understanding. As says Isaiah, "Vexation makes us to understand how the soul that is empty and disencumbered, as is necessary for his divine influence, is instructed supernaturally by God in his divine wisdom through this dark and arid night of contemplation, as we have said." And this instruction God gave not in those first sweetnesses and joys. This is very well explained by the same prophet Isaiah, where he says, "Whom shall God teach his knowledge, and whom shall he make to understand the hearing? To those," he says, "that are weaned from the milk and drawn away from the breasts." Here it is shown that the first milk of spiritual sweetness is no preparation for this divine influence. Neither is there preparation in attachment to the breast of delectable meditations, belonging to the faculties of sense, which gave the soul pleasure. Such preparation consists rather in the lack of the one and withdrawal from the other, inasmuch as, in order to listen to God, the soul needs to stand upright and to be detached, with regard to affection and sense, even as the prophet says concerning himself, in these words, "I will stand upon my watch," this is that detachment of desire, "and I will make firm my step," that is, I will not meditate with sense, in order to contemplate, that is, in order to understand that which may come to me from God. So we have now arrived at this, that from this arid night there first of all comes self-knowledge, whence, as from a foundation, rises this other knowledge of God. For which cause St. Augustine said to God, "Let me know myself, Lord, and I shall know thee." For, as the philosophers say, one extreme can be well known by another. And in order to prove more completely how efficacious is this night of sense, with its aridity and its desolation, in bringing the soul that light which, as we say, it receives there from God, we shall quote that passage of David, wherein he clearly describes the great power which is in this night for bringing the soul this lofty knowledge of God. He says, "Then, thus, in the desert land, waterless, dry, and pathless, I appeared before thee, that I might see thy virtue and thy glory." It is a wondrous thing that David should say here, that the means and the preparation for his knowledge of the glory of God were not the spiritual delights and the many pleasures which he had experienced, but the aridities and detachments of his sensual nature, which is here to be understood by the dry and desert land. No less wondrous is it that he should describe as the road to his perception and vision of the virtue of God, not the divine meditations and conceptions of which he had often made use, but his being unable to form any conception of God or to walk by meditation produced by imaginary consideration, which is here to be understood by the pathless land. So that the means to a knowledge of God and of oneself is this dark night with its aridities and voids, although it leads not to a knowledge of him of the same plenitude and abundance that comes from the other night of the Spirit, since this is only, as it were, the beginning of that other. Likewise, from the aridities and voids of this night of the desire, the soul draws spiritual humility, which is the contrary virtue to the first capital sin, which, as we said, is spiritual pride. Through this humility, which is acquired by the said knowledge of self, the soul is purged from all those imperfections whereinto it fell with respect to that sin of pride in the time of its prosperity. For it sees itself so dry and miserable that the idea never even occurs to it that it is making better progress than others, or outstripping them, as it believed itself to be doing before. On the contrary, it recognizes that others are making better progress than itself, and hence arises the love of its neighbors, for it esteems them and judges them not as it was wont to do aforetime, when it saw that itself had great fervor, and others not so. It is aware only of its own wretchedness, which it keeps before its eyes to such an extent that it never forgets it, nor takes occasion to set its eyes on anyone else. This was described wonderfully by David, when he was in this night, in these words: "I was dumb and was humbled, and kept silence from good things, and my sorrow was renewed." This he says because it seemed to him that the good that was in his soul had so completely departed, that not only did he neither speak nor find any language concerning it, but with respect to the good of others, he was likewise dumb because of his grief at the knowledge of his misery. In this condition, again, souls become submissive and obedient upon the spiritual road. For, when they see their own misery, not only do they hear what is taught them, but they even desire that anyone soever may set them on the way and tell them what they ought to do. The effective presumption which they sometimes had in their prosperity is taken from them. And finally, there are swept away from them on this road all the other imperfections, which we noted above with respect to this first sin, which is spiritual pride. Chapter 13. Of other benefits which this night of sense causes in the soul. With respect to the soul's imperfections of spiritual avarice, because of which it coveted this and that spiritual thing, and found no satisfaction in this and that exercise, by reason of its covetousness, for the desire and pleasure which it found therein, this arid and dark night has now greatly reformed it. For, as it finds not the pleasure and sweetness which it was wont to find, but rather finds affliction and lack of sweetness, it has such moderate recourse to them that it might possibly now lose, through defective use, what aforetime it lost through excess. Although as a rule God gives to those whom he leads into this night humility and readiness, albeit with lack of sweetness, so that what is commanded them they may do for God's sake alone. And thus they no longer seek profit in many things, because they find no pleasure in them. With respect to spiritual luxury, it is likewise clearly seen that, through this aridity and lack of sensible sweetness, which the soul finds in spiritual things, it is freed from those impurities which we there noted. For we said that, as a rule, they proceeded from the pleasure which overflowed from spirit into sense. But with regard to the imperfections from which the soul frees itself in this dark night, with respect to the fourth sin, which is spiritual gluttony, they may be found above, though they have not all been described there, because they are innumerable. And thus I will not detail them here, for I would fain make an end of this night, in order to pass to the next, concerning which we shall have to pronounce grave words and instructions. Let it suffice for the understanding of the innumerable benefits which, over and above those mentioned, the soul gains in this night, with respect to this sin of spiritual gluttony, to say that it frees itself from all those imperfections which have there been described, and from many other and greater evils, and vile abominations which are not written above, into which fell many of whom we have had experience, because they had not reformed their desire as concerning this inordinate love of spiritual sweetness. For in this arid and dark night wherein he sets the soul, God has restrained its concupiscence and curbed its desire so that the soul cannot feed upon any pleasure or sweetness of sense, whether from above or from below. And this he continues to do after such manner that the soul is subjected, reformed, and repressed with respect to concupiscence and desire. It loses the strength of its passions and concupiscence, and it becomes sterile, because it no longer consults its likings. Just as, when none is accustomed to take milk from the breast, the courses of the milk are dried up, so the desires of the soul are dried up. And besides these things, there follow admirable benefits from this spiritual sobriety. For, when desire and concupiscence are quenched, the soul lives in spiritual tranquility and peace. For, where desire and concupiscence reign not, there is no disturbance, but peace and consolation of God. From this there arises another and a second benefit, which is that the soul habitually has remembrance of God, with fear and dread of backsliding upon the spiritual road. As has been said, this is a great benefit, and not one of the least that results from this aridity and purgation of the desire, for the soul is purified and cleansed of the imperfections that were clinging to it, because of the desires and affections, which of their own accord deaden and darken the soul. There is another very great benefit for the soul in this night, which is that it practices several virtues together, as, for example, patience and long-suffering, which are often called upon in these times of emptiness and aridity, when the soul endures and perseveres in its spiritual exercises without consolation and without pleasure. It practices the charity of God, since it is not now moved by the pleasure of attraction and sweetness which it finds in its work, but only by God. It likewise practices here the virtue of fortitude, because, in these difficulties and insipidities which it finds in its work, it brings strength out of weakness and thus becomes strong. All the virtues, in short, the theological and also the cardinal and moral, both in body and in spirit, are practiced by the soul in these times of aridity. And that in this night the soul obtains these four benefits which we have here described, namely, delight of peace, habitual remembrance, and thought of God, cleanness and purity of soul, and the practice of the virtues which we have just described. David tells us, having experienced it himself when he was in this night, in these words, "My soul refused consolations. I had remembrance of God. I found consolation and was exercised, and my spirit failed." And he then says, "And I meditated by night with my heart and was exercised, and I swept and purified my spirit." That is to say, from all the affections. With respect to the imperfections of the other three spiritual sins which we have described above, which are wrath, envy, and sloth, the soul is purged hereof, likewise in this aridity of the desire, and acquires the virtues opposed to them. 4. Softened and humbled by these aridities and hardships, and other temptations and trials wherein God exercises it during this night, it becomes meek with respect to God and to itself, and likewise with respect to its neighbor, so that it is no longer disturbed and angry with itself because of its own faults, nor with its neighbor because of his, neither is it displeased with God, nor does it utter unseemly complaints, because he does not quickly make it holy. Then, as to envy, the soul has charity toward others in this respect also. For, if it has any envy, this is no longer a vice, as it was before, when it was grieved because others were preferred to it and given greater advantage. Its grief now comes from seeing how great is its own misery, and its envy, if it has any, is a virtuous envy, since it desires to imitate others, which is great virtue. Neither are the sloth and the irksomeness which it now experiences concerning spiritual things vicious as they were before. For in the past these sins proceeded from the spiritual pleasures which the soul sometimes experienced and sought after when it found them not. But this new weariness proceeds not from this insufficiency of pleasure, because God has taken from the soul pleasure in all things, in this purgation of the desire. Besides these benefits which have been mentioned, the soul attains innumerable others by means of this arid contemplation. For often, in the midst of these times of aridity and hardship, God communicates to the soul, when it is least expecting it, the purest spiritual sweetness and love, together with a spiritual knowledge which is sometimes very delicate, each manifestation of which is of greater benefit and worth than those which the soul enjoyed aforetime. Although in its beginnings the soul thinks that this is not so, for the spiritual influence, now granted to it, is very delicate and cannot be perceived by sense. Finally, inasmuch as the soul is now purged from the affections and desires of sense, it obtains liberty of spirit, whereby in ever greater degree it gains the 12 fruits of the Holy Spirit. Here, too, it is wondrously delivered from the hands of its three enemies: devil, world, and flesh, quenched. For its pleasure and delight of sense being quenched with respect to all things, neither the devil nor the world, nor sensuality, has any arms or any strength wherewith to make war upon the spirit. These times of aridity, then, cause the soul to journey in all purity in the love of God, since it is no longer influenced in its actions by the pleasure and sweetness of the actions themselves, as perchance it was when it experienced sweetness, but only by a desire to please God. It becomes neither presumptuous nor self-satisfied, as perchance it was wont to become in the time of its prosperity, but fearful and timid with regard to itself, finding in itself no satisfaction whatsoever. And herein consists that holy fear which preserves and increases the virtues. This aridity, too, quenches natural energy and concupiscence, as has also been said, save for the pleasure, indeed, which at certain times God himself infuses into it. It is a wonder if it finds pleasure and consolation of sense, through its own diligence, in any spiritual exercise or action, as has already been said. There grows within souls that experience this arid night concern for God and yearnings to serve him. For in proportion as the breasts of sensuality, wherewith it sustained and nourished the desires that it pursued, are drying up, there remains nothing in that aridity and detachment save the yearning to serve God, which is a thing very pleasing to God. For, as David says, an afflicted spirit is a sacrifice to God. When the soul, then, knows that, in this arid purgation through which it has passed, it has derived and attained so many and such precious benefits as those which have here been described, it tarries not in crying, as in the stanza of which we are expounding the lines, "Oh, happy chance! I went forth without being observed." That is, I went forth from the bonds and subjection of the desires of sense and the affections without being observed. That is to say, without the three enemies aforementioned being able to keep me from it. These enemies, as we have said, bind the soul, as with bonds, in its desires and pleasures, and prevent it from going forth from itself to the liberty of the love of God. And without these desires and pleasures they cannot give battle to the soul, as has been said. When, therefore, the four passions of the soul, which are joy, grief, hope, and fear, are calmed through continual mortification, when the natural desires have been lulled to sleep in the sensual nature of the soul, by means of habitual times of aridity, and when the harmony of the senses and the interior faculties causes a suspension of labor and a cessation from the work of meditation, as we have said, which is the dwelling and the household of the lower part of the soul, these enemies cannot obstruct this spiritual liberty, and the house remains at rest and quiet. As says the following line, "My house being now at rest." Chapter 14 expounds this last line of the first stanza, when this house of sensuality was now at rest, that is, was mortified, its passions being quenched, and its desires put to rest, and lulled to sleep by means of this blessed night of the purgation of sense. The soul went forth to set out upon the road and way of the Spirit, which is that of progressives and proficients, and which, by another name, is called the way of illumination, or of infused contemplation, wherein God himself feeds and refreshes the soul, without meditation or the soul's active help. Such, as we have said, is the night and purgation of sense in the soul. In those who have afterwards to enter the other and more formidable night of the Spirit, in order to pass to the divine union of love of God, for not all pass habitually thereto, but only the smallest number, it is wont to be accompanied by formidable trials and temptations of sense, which last for a long time, albeit longer in some than in others. For to some the angel of Satan presents himself, namely, the spirit of fornication, that he may buffet their senses with abominable and violent temptations, and trouble their spirits with vile considerations and representations, which are most visible to the imagination, which things at times are a greater affliction to them than death. At other times in this night there is added to these things the spirit of blasphemy, which roams abroad, setting in the path of all the conceptions and thoughts of the soul intolerable blasphemies. These it sometimes suggests to the imagination with such violence that the soul almost utters them, which is a grave torment to it. At other times another abominable spirit, which Esaias calls spiritus vertiginis, is allowed to molest them, not in order that they may fall, but that it may try them. This spirit darkens their senses in such a way that it fills them with numerous scruples and perplexities, so confusing that, as they judge, they can never, by any means, be satisfied concerning them, neither can they find any help for their judgment in counsel or thought. This is one of the severest goads and horrors of this night, very closely akin to that which passes in the night of the spirit. As a rule, these storms and trials are sent by God in this night and purgation of sense, to those whom afterwards he purposes to lead into the other night, though not all reach it, to the end that, when they have been chastened and buffeted, they may in this way continually exercise and prepare themselves, and continually accustom their senses and faculties to the union of wisdom which is to be bestowed upon them in that other night. For, if the soul be not tempted, exercised and proved with trials and temptations, it cannot quicken its sense of wisdom. For this reason it is said in Ecclesiasticus, "He that has not been tempted, what does he know? And he that has not been proved, what are the things that he recognizes?" To this truth Jeremiah bears good witness, saying, "Thou didst chastise me, Lord, and I was instructed." And the most proper form of this chastisement, for one who will enter into wisdom, is that of the interior trials which we are here describing, inasmuch as it is these which most effectively purge sense of all favors and consolations to which it was affected with natural weakness, and by which the soul is truly humiliated in preparation for the exaltation which it is to experience. For how long a time the soul will be held in this fasting and penance of sense cannot be said with any certainty. For all do not experience it after one manner, neither do all encounter the same temptations. For this is meted out by the will of God, in conformity with the greater or the smaller degree of imperfection, which each soul has to purge away. In conformity, likewise, with the degree of love of union to which God is pleased to raise it, he will humble it with greater or less intensity, or in greater or less time. Those who have the disposition and greater strength to suffer, he purges with greater intensity and more quickly. But those who are very weak are kept for a long time in this night, and these he purges very gently and with slight temptations. Habitually, too, he gives them refreshments of sense, so that they may not fall away, and only after a long time do they attain to purity of perfection in this life, some of them never attaining to it at all. Such are neither properly in the night nor properly out of it. For, although they make no progress, yet, in order that they may continue in humility and self-knowledge, God exercises them for certain periods and at certain times in those temptations and aridities. And at other times and seasons, he assists them with consolations, lest they should grow faint and return to seek the consolations of the world. Other souls, which are weaker, God himself accompanies, now appearing to them, now moving farther away, that he may exercise them in his love. For without such turnings away they would not learn to reach God. But the souls which are to pass on to that happy and high estate, the union of love, are wont as a rule to remain for a long time in these aridities and temptations, however quickly God may lead them, as has been seen by experience. It is time, then, to begin to treat of the second night. Thank you for staying to the end of Dark Night of the Soul, Part 1. In this first part, St. John of the Cross leads us into the night of sense, a purification God works in beginners to loosen the soul from subtle self-attachment. He shows that even sincere devotion can be mixed with spiritual pride, a craving for consolations, irritation when sweetness is removed, or a quiet spiritual sloth when holy things feel dry. These are not revealed to discourage us, but to explain why the soul must be led by God into a new way, the way of purer faith and a love that is being cleansed. He also teaches discernment. Not every dryness is a sign of decline. At times, God withdraws sensible support, so we may learn to remain with him without demanding anything for ourselves, and so we do not measure holiness by feelings. In this night, the soul is invited to simplicity, perseverance, and calm fidelity, not forcing its own light, but trusting the hidden light God gives in his own time and manner. If you are walking through dryness, remember the closing image of the first stanza, "My house being now at rest." St. John is pointing to a grace that quiets the turbulence of the senses, so the soul may love God with greater freedom. May today's listening help you grow in humility, endurance, and trust, even when prayer becomes nothing more than silent presence before the Lord. If you would like to continue this journey with Verbum Day, please subscribe so you don't miss Dark Night of the Soul, Part 2, and the next parts. May God be with you and grant you peace.